Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Katie. I'm a member of Hackney SWP and I'll be chairing today's meeting on Degrowth, What Do Marxists Say? Just a run through of the structure of today's meeting. The speaker is going to speak for roughly 30 minutes. Then you'll have time to chat amongst the people around you, sitting next to you for around 2 to 3 minutes on what you thought. And then there'll be a period of time where we can ask those questions and contributions to the speaker, and he'll have time to come back on them. So our speaker today is Martin Empson. He's a long-standing member of the SWP, but he's also author of a brilliant book, Socialism or Extinction. So without further ado, over to you, Martin.
Thank you. Let's hope you're clapping at the end. I'm going to start with climate change, and I want to do that because this meeting isn't going to be about climate change, but it is in the context of the global ecological catastrophe. That context is very, very real. There are 100 million people currently in the Great Horn of Africa who have had 5 years of consecutive drought, who are living in incredibly dire circumstances. The media likes to focus on the smog in New York, the terrible wildfires in Canada, and so on. They're less focused on the appalling hurricane that devastated parts of Myanmar a few weeks before that. It's a global catastrophe that is hitting us in a very, very real way. The heat wave that we experienced a couple of weekends ago saw the highest ever day of admissions to British accident and emergency hospitals as a result of heat stroke, as a result of asthma and other related issues. It's a global catastrophe, and this meeting is about the responses of the radical movement to the catastrophe. And I want to make that very, very clear at the start. I'm also now going to frame the discussion about degrowth by talking about growth. I want to start, though, by saying that there's a slight difficulty with the title, What Do Marxists Say? Because Marxists say a lot of different things about degrowth. Not all of them agree with each other. I'm going to give my own interpretation. I'm sure the people in the room will have their own opinions and so on. But what I'm going to be talking about is an emerging and developing set of ideas that vary in a number of different ways, but have a central key argument, which is that the nature of the economy, the capitalist economy, is such that we have to move away from a growing economy and switch to one that is degrowing the sectors that are most destructive to humans and to the natural world. And that's a set of ideas. They're epitomised in a whole series of books, some brilliant, some not so brilliant, a couple of relatively good ones here that I think, Jason Hickel's Less is More, and The Case of Degrowth by a number of different authors. And what I'm going to try and do today is to sort of summarise some of those ideas, put my arguments and try and contextualise it, and then put an argument about how Marxists understand the world and how we think we can change. But let's start with the question of growth, because that, after all, is what degrowthers are arguing against. Back in September 2019, in the midst of the climate strikes, Greta Thunberg made a brilliant speech to the United Nations climate talk, where it's the one where she said, how dare you, she said, and she quite rightly did. And she said this: we're at the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal growth. I think for many of us that captured that sense of rage and anger at people who failed to deal with climate change for so long. Greta Thunberg is obviously a very famous activist. At the other end of the spectrum is a woman who most people in the room probably have completely forgotten. Perhaps if you're an international visitor to Marxism, you'll never have heard of her. Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister of Britain for about 30 minutes a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you remember, but Liz Truss, at the end of her period in Downing Street, she made a speech where she blamed what she called an anti-growth coalition of trade unions, environmentalists, Green campaigners, Labour Party members, Liberal Democrats apparently, for destroying her government. Now, I'll be honest, the anti-growth coalition existed entirely in Liz Truss's head. However, I am proud to have been part of the and I say that because I think, despite the criticisms that I will articulate in this meeting, I think we have to emphasize that we are on the same side as those people who argue for degrowth. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Now, Liz Truss made the anti-growth coalition, but actually the concept of growth is central to the most mainstream ways, and even some radical left ways, of understanding capitalism. Keir Starmer put a big emphasis a few weeks back, one of his 5 missions to help Britain. He said that at the end of the first term of a Labour government, of the next Labour government, Britain would have the highest rate of sustained growth of the G7 nations. Now, in many ways, that is in direct critique or against the likes of Greta Thunberg, certainly the degrowth theorists who argue we have to have the opposite. So you can already see a tension developing around these things. And I would also argue, I'm going to try and come onto this at the end a little bit, that there's a sort of pseudo-Marxist radical left argument for growth, which also comes about as a result of a misreading of some of what Marx wrote around the development of the productive forces in society, and this particularly arose out of how the Soviet Union, a society that I would argue is not socialist, but how they saw growth as being necessary in order to develop their economy because of the competition with the West and all the problems that occurred for them. So having framed the discussion, let's go a little bit further, because I think a starting point here is what Greta Thunberg said, is that actually this is a system that destroys, that it degrades, that it breaks, that it leads to the destruction and the horrors that we all know of it. And many of those problems arise out of the very nature of capitalism itself. And capitalism, I think, is a system of growth, but actually it's a little bit more than that. I think for many of the people who write and think about degrowth, what they tend to do is to isolate the fact that the capitalist economy grows from actually the structures and the nature of the capitalist society itself. And so what I want to do here is to begin by explaining how capitalism, why capitalism grows. And Marx had quite a lot to say about this. If you've ever read Capital or some of other Marx's other economic writings, or certainly the work of Marxists who've followed in his stead, what you'll see in his analysis of capitalism, right at the heart of it, is his sense of a system where the capitalists are compelled to behave in a particular way by the very structure of capitalism itself. Marx argues that there are 2 great divisions in capitalist societies. The first is the obvious one, the one between the exploiters at the top and the exploited, between the bosses and the workers. We all know that, we've all experienced it, we've all lived it, and so on. But there's another division that is equally important in many ways for Marx, and that's the division between the capitalists, the competition. Marx described capitalism as a system of competitive accumulation, and he argues that the accumulation arises out of the first 2 systems of capitalism. Workers are exploited. They are paid a wage, a certain amount per day, but in their work, they create more value for the capitalists than they are paid in wages. And this means that the capitalists can steal from a worker, from workers in the factory or the call center or wherever they work, what Marx called surplus value every day. And that surplus value is the origin of profits. But it actually plays a particular role for the capitalist, because what the capitalist has to do is to stay ahead of all the other capitalists that he or she is competing against. A rat race, because if you don't stay ahead of them, you risk falling behind, you risk going bankrupt, and you risk falling away and not being able to continue all your business. Because what the capitalist is most interested in doing, above all anything else, is maximizing profit, making as much profits as they can, and to do that they have to stay ahead of the game. So what the capitalist does is they take some of that surplus value, in fact they take most of that surplus value, and they reinvest it back into their system of production, back into their factories, back into their manufacturing plant, back into finding new products to develop, new technologies, new ways to exploit workers, and so on, which means that each individual block of capital grows over time as the capitalists invest their surplus value over time. And I want to emphasize that when Marx writes about this, he very explicitly says that this is a compulsion for the capitalists. Any capitalist that tries to break from this, any capitalist that decides, hey, I'm not going to be part of the rat race, I'm going to go and sit away and be nice to my workers, they will fall behind, they will go bankrupt, they'll be overtaken by their rivals and eaten up. It's something they cannot escape from. Having made that summary of Marx's work, it's worth emphasising, I think very important to emphasise, that this is actually an understanding that is shared by the vast majority of people who call themselves degrowthers. For instance, the two books I waved here at the start, The Case for Degrowth, the authors of that write that, unlike other human economies, capitalist ones depend upon growth. In order to thrive amid market competition, those who have money must invest it, make more money, and expand production. It's a pretty similar analysis to what Marx said. Similarly, Jason Hickel, who I think is one of the best writers in the degrowth theory, and if you have to read one book, Less is More by Jason Hickel is probably the one to do that. Hickel says, the tricky part is we've got little choice about this. Capitalism is fundamentally dependent on growth. Growth is a structural imperative, an iron law. So not a vast difference in this sense between Marxist theory, Marxist economics, and many of the people who write about degrowth and so on. And this logic of accumulation for the sake of accumulation, as Marx said, that the capitalists are compelled to behave this, pervades the whole of society, and indeed it pervades it becomes the sort of what's the word? The dominant way to understand capitalism and to see the health of the economic system itself. So that's why when you open the newspapers, when you listen to the commentary, when you listen to the politicians and so on, they're obsessed with growth. They're worried about growth if it's low. They want to get it high, just as Keir Starmer sees that. He's sending a message to the economists, to the Bank of England and the rest of it, that capital will be safe in Labour's hands because they're interested in growth, not like those lefties who want to see degrowth and the rest of it. And it pervades right to the heart of the working class movement as well. And in a sense, that's natural. We've all heard of situations where bosses have said, look, we can't give pay rise this year because profits the company isn't growing enough. Governments that say the economy isn't doing well enough, it's not growing enough, so we can't pay the rail workers or avoid redundancies or help the public services and so on. And so the reformist movement tends to see that solving some of these problems requires expanding an economy and capitalism doing well. You see this obviously with the Labour Party movement. With the Labour Party, you also see it with the trade union movement, or often sees the health of the particular company or the particular economy as being the same as of the needs of the workers. Unless the pie expands, we can't give a bigger slice to the working class. I think that's a problem because it tends to encourage a sort of idea that the interests of the capitalists are the same as the interests of the workers. Now, what's the consequence of this growth? And many books have been written by degrowth theorists who explore how a growing economy doesn't benefit everyone equally. And I haven't, unfortunately, got time to go into great detail of this, but actually, over time, a growing economy doesn't benefit everyone equally. If you just leave an economy to grow, it tends to exacerbate and encourage the dynamics of capitalism, which lead to a concentration of wealth in blocks of capital and a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few rich individuals. But there are other consequences which are important. John Bellamy Foster, the American Marxist ecologist, writes, and I think very perceptively, that the accumulation of capital is accompanied by the accumulation of catastrophe. I think that's a really interesting insight, because what he's arguing, what he shows there, is that as capital grows, because capitalism is based on the exploitation of workers, which I've talked about, but also a negative, degrading relationship with the natural world, then any growth in the economy expands that exploitation and expands that destruction of nature. And I think it's something that most environmentalists grasp instinctively, even if they're not revolutionaries or socialists. That slogan, you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet, for many people, I think for many activists, epitomizes that problem. The other thing that happens as a consequence of growth is it gives our economies and our politicians, indeed ourselves sometimes, a very distorted view of what's valuable about society, because you end up only valuing things that are supposed to determine and improve prove growth. And the biggest and best example, again, I haven't got time to go into this, but there's a number of works by David Pilling and so on who look at this, that argues that the main measure for judging growth, gross domestic product GDP, which has grown about 3% year on year since the end of the Second World War, is judged on a few set factors that don't necessarily tell you much about the economy, but tell you certainly a lot about capitalism. So it celebrates, for instance, things like the finance industry or the banking industry. It celebrates trade and purchasing and selling of products. What it doesn't celebrate is all that other stuff that happens in the economy that makes life worth living. It doesn't measure, for instance, childcare in the home. If you send your child to a private nursery, it contributes to GDP and thus to growth. If you take care of your children at home, the work predominantly of women in society, actually it's not counted by the capitalists. And you can see how the emphasis on growth and how they measure growth leads to a distortion of how the world is seen and understood. A classic example of this is that if I pay someone to paint my house, it will contribute to GDP. If I invite some friends over to do it, it won't contribute to GDP because it's not measured. So all that sort of communal living and working doesn't contribute. And despite this, to re-emphasize a point, because it will come up later in this talk, growth doesn't benefit ordinary people. If you think about that period of growth from the Second World War, 3% year on year globally, actually what have we seen in that time? We've seen economies stagnate for working, wages stagnate. We've seen public healthcare and services being cut back, and so on. A worsening scenario, despite the economy of doing well by their judgment. So, what is degrowth? And I would say, it's most simply, degrowth is a reaction to this. Jason Hickel puts it well. Degrowth, he says, is the planned reduction of excess energy and resource use to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. And at best, people like Hickel and many other theorists argue for a vision of the economy that is one that has much overlap with what socialists and Marxists would say, a more equitable society, one where wages are higher, one where there's more healthcare, more education, more public services, and crucially less of the things that aren't necessary, that we don't think are necessary. Why do we need an arms industry? Why do we need an advertising industry? We certainly don't need the fossil fuel industry. And so what degrowthers tend to argue is a vision of what they would call it as a degrowth society in the future, but also a sort of transition to that, where there's a phasing out of the negative things of society and an improvement of the things that we need more, and the consequent improvement to human lives. Jason Hickel, again, to pick on him, but I do think he's the best of these writers, argues that what we need to do is to separate social progress from economic growth. And in particular, he locates these arguments within the ecological catastrophe that we face and sees it as an urgent need, quite rightly, I would argue, and a way to deal with these crises. And there would be overlap. For instance, I think they would be very much supportive of the 1 million climate jobs campaign strategy by the Climate Campaign Against Climate Change, the vision that you can create jobs to improve the economy, improve public services, and reduce emissions and cut back on those negative and destructive industries that there are. And I say this, and I should emphasize again, that for these thinkers, degrowth is not green austerity. They are not saying working people, labouring people in the global north or indeed in the global south should lose out as a result of a transition to a more equitable and more sustainable economy. They particularly emphasise that the global north has to shrink its worst aspects of its economy, and they particularly emphasise that it's the rich that has to be cut back and so on. The exciting part, says Hickel, is we know we can do all this at the same time as ending poverty, improving human well-being, and ensuring good lives for all. Indeed, that's the core principle of degrowth. I emphasise that because you do hear in left meetings a criticism of degrowth. It says, oh, they all just want us to wear hair shirts. They all just want us to have negative things. That's not true, certainly in the dominant discourse around that. I'll come back to some of the problems later. So I mentioned problems, and I'm now going to talk about what I perceive as the problems with degrowth, despite having, I think, perhaps encouraged an idea that much of it we would support. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to separate and distinguish myself from a right-wing critique of degrowth. There are a number of theorists and writers who argue that degrowth is wrong, it can't work, and it's unnecessary because actually we can expand the economy in ways that will improve our world. Just need better technology, better management of that technology. For shorthand, they'll call these people technologists or eco-modernists and so on. And I've written some critiques which you can find online if you want to read about that, because I don't sadly have time to go into that. Because I want to come to what I see as the Marxist critiques of degrowth. And the first of this actually links back to something I mentioned just a few moments ago, which is the question of austerity. See, I think there's a conceptual problem with degrowth. You might call it a problem with marketing or whatever, but I think for most working people around the world, we have seen 14 or 15 years of austerity, public services being cut by governments, wage stagnation, etc., etc. It's been a conscious strategy for different governments in a neoliberal way to improve their growth rates in the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2018. And the danger is, I think, that many working people who've seen those cuts, those job losses and those wage cuts and so on, can only hear in degrowth something that is negative and will involve losses to them. And there's an instinctive response to that, which is why sometimes in trade union meetings, when you talk about degrowth and so on, you get a sort of automatic rejection. It's particularly a problem for activists in the global south. And here I think we have to side with those activists in the global south, and many, indeed many of the people I've already written about, talked about, do that, because what their reaction is to say, why are you telling us to degrow our economies when you've got so much and we have got so little? And I think this is a good argument. It's particularly an argument when some, and I will emphasize it's a minority of degrowth thinkers, will use language like frugal living or creating beautiful poor spaces. This sends a message to people who have very little in the way of public services, jobs, wages, and so on, that they cannot have any more because of the ecological and environmental needs of the planet. Now, we as Marxists argue that the global south has been impoverished and underdeveloped as a result of the way that capitalism has developed. The primitive accumulation of the destruction of the commons, the destruction of the global south through the process of colonialism that stripped resources and people and wealth from the colonial countries, and then the ongoing imperialist processes that have been so destructive. And I side with those in the global south who actually want more development and more improvements to their economies. And also I think we have to side with them to say that those improvements will come as a result of their struggles against capital and so on. Something that I'll come back to at the end of this talk. The second problem with degrowth theory, I would say, is it often uses the language, quite rightly in many ways, about natural limits. There's an argument that says, look, there are a set of natural limits that are a result of the way physics and biology and chemistry work that cannot be surpassed if you don't want to have catastrophic climate change. And this is all very well and good, and it is absolutely true that there are those natural limits in terms of the environment and so on. The danger is that it can open up the door to people who say, well, the only problem is that there are too many people on the planet. Now, I don't have got time now to go into Marxist critique of Malthusianism, the idea of overpopulation and so on, but I do want to emphasize that the degrowth movement has this at its core for a great risk to itself. In the 1970s, 1972, older comrades in the room might remember, a set of academics and public intellectuals created what was called the Club of Rome, and they wrote a very, very highly selling, very popular book called The Limits to Growth, which was essentially a Malthusian argument. It said everything depends, all resource use is related to the number of people. As the population expands, it will destroy the environment. There was no attempt to locate that within the wider structures or nature of capitalism. And I think degrowth, at perhaps its worst, can open the door to those arguments and certainly leave that open up to interpretation like that. And Marxists, I would argue, and indeed the best degrowth thinkers, certainly the ones I talked about today, would argue that the problem isn't too many people, the problem is a nature of a capitalist system that destroys in the name of profit. The biggest problem, though, I think, with degrowth is that it leaves capitalism intact. Now, I want to argue that because of what I said at the beginning about the nature of growth in capitalism, that compulsion to accumulate wealth for the sake of accumulation that arises out of the drive to make profits, actually, unless you destroy and break that compulsion, you will never have a system that can be sustainable or equitable for everyone, because the system as a whole will always be geared to maximizing profit. That said, degrowth theorists, I think, are by and large anti-capitalist in the sense that they dislike and hate capitalism, want to see it ended, but they're not they're not revolutionaries. And in that sense, degrowth, I think, is a reformist strategy that hopes to shrink parts of the economy to lead to a more sustainable, more equitable world in the short term, but falls apart when it comes to saying how can that then lead to a different way of organising a society. And in this sense, I want to use a quote from Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher of the 1930s and 1940s, to articulate really what I mean by that, because he said, Marx says that revolutions are the locomotives of world history, but the situation may be quite different. Perhaps revolutions are not the train ride, but the human race grabbing for the emergency brake. And I think that epitomizes really what we as Marxists say about how change can happen, can arise out of revolutionary strategy and can lead to the emergency brake being pulled, thank you very much, and a better way of organising society. And unfortunately, I don't think that most or any degrowth theorists really have a vision of how that radical change can take place. They do have some strategies. Jason Hickel has a 5-point pathways, he calls them, to a post-capitalist world. All of them I agree with. End planned obsolescence, shift from ownership to usership, cut advertising, end food waste, scale down ecologically destructive industries. But that's not a pathway to a post-capitalist world. Those are reforms that we would support and want to fight for. They're not a strategy for changing the world fundamentally. Others have written, again, something I agree with, the rich should be taxed out of existence. Well, I agree with that. But that's not going to happen under capitalism, because it would involve a confrontation with the forces of capital that can only be solved through a revolutionary strategy. Degrowth theories are also fond of arguing for community-owned or worker-owned cooperatives to create what you might call islands of degrowth within wider capitalism. They're often fond of quoting the industrial workers of the world's old slogan, build a new world in the shell of the old. Again, the problem with this is all very well and good, but those islands, those community-owned projects, those workers' cooperatives are still buffeted by the storms of capitalism, by an economic crisis, by the fact that they might be taken over or they might lose out in the grand scheme of things. And we support those ideas, but they are not a vision for overthrowing capitalism. And fundamentally then, really, this becomes a question of how you win fundamental change in society. And I would argue that we have to see, while sharing many of the ideas of the degrowth theorists and agreeing with them on much, we also have to argue for a strategy to change the world. And that means that we have to talk about movements, class struggle, social movements that can have the power to change society. Flip back right to the beginning of my talk. What were those two things in society that Marx identified? The competition between the capitalists, but the exploitative relationship between the workers. And that's our key, because for Marx and for Marxists, workers have the power to change society, because it's workers' labour that ultimately produces almost all of the wealth that the capitalists then use to grow their economy. And by withdrawing that labour, workers then have immense power to stop the wheels of capitalism, power to stop particular industries or particular workplaces, but simultaneously the power through their own self-organisation to create new ways of organising society. And in my book, which is on sale at the end of the meeting, I talk really about how that revolutionary process can happen. What's the flip side of it? Let's imagine you're a degrowth theorist and somehow you can implement some of these changes. Actually, let's look at what happens when we try to radically confront capitalism without challenging the forces of the state. Look at what happened to the Salvador Allende government in the early 1970s in Chile. There, Allende introduced a series of quite minor reforms in many ways, but because they opposed the logic of capitalism, he was met by the most brutal and vicious, violent repression and a coup from General Pinochet and supported by the CIA, which led to Allende being killed and thousands of other activists being destroyed. I point to this not to celebrate that, but to say, look, unless you have a strategy for protecting and winning and extending your reforms, it becomes a confrontation to capitalism. Capitalism will come back and take what you have won from it. And that the vision of socialism that we have is one where we have a radically different way of organizing society. Would socialism be a growth economy or a degrowth economy? I raise this question because I'm sure it will come up in the discussion, and I know Joe, just chatting with the chair, a Japanese Marxist called Koho Sato has recently written a book called Why Marx Was a Degrowth Communist. I actually think it's not a good way to look at the question, because actually I think that if we had workers' control, a democratic society where we organise production, we would degrow parts of the economy. If we had a revolution tomorrow, I'd like to think that workers would say, let's start phasing out the fossil fuel industry, let's scrap the advertising industry, let's degrow those bits of the economy. But we would also expand other things. We'd build things, we'd build schools and swimming pools and health centres, and we'd expand production, and we'd expand in certain areas, but we would do it in a rationally planned, organised way that allowed us as the new workers' society to control and rationally plan our relationship to nature and humanity. So I'm not sure it's useful to talk about a future socialist society being either growth or degrowth. Let's remember what Marx and Engels said at the end of the Communist Manifesto, near the end of the Communist Manifesto. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. I think that's a much better way of understanding how we hope to build a society that can be sustainable and equitable for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. That was brilliant. Okay, we're now going to have 2 to 3 minutes to discuss with the people sitting next to you, and then you can pose those contributions to the speaker himself. Okay, if comrades could wrap up their discussions, I think we're going to bring it back to the floor now. So if you just raise your hand to indicate you would like to speak, and I'll call on your name, or not name, but I'll indicate, and someone can bring a microphone over to you. Just a reminder to keep contributions to 3 minutes. Once you get to 2 minutes, I'll let you know. Because we want as many people to contribute as possible. So yeah, please raise hands, questions, contributions. Okay. We'll go to comrade in the black t-shirt at the front row, and then comrade beside him.
Thanks. Great talk. I'll try and phrase this in a good way, but you were mentioning or showing the Marxist critique of the depopulation side of degrowth. However, I wanted to, explore that a bit more. I know, of course, it's good to go against perhaps like a government enforced or any enforcement of depopulation or anti-natalism, but however, I think there just to go look more into that whereas you mentioned like 1945 or after World War II, there's a lot more economic growth, and I think similarly after World War II, there's a great population increase. And I wonder if those two if there is a correlation there, and maybe if it's more of like a cultural thing of perhaps there should be a cultural de-emphasis on population. Is that, or I guess just, do you have any more opinions about depopulation and the depopulation aspect of degrowth?
Okay, yep. So the comrade next to him, and then we will take this comrade also in the front row. We'll take her after.
Okay. Can you hear? Yeah. Thanks for that, Martin. Basically agree with it, but I wonder, would you agree with it with a couple of additional points. One is that reformism, I think absolutely, and in its heyday back in the 50s and 60s, absolutely depended on new growth, i.e. do not upset existing wealth, do not upset existing wealth holders. And I think in this situation, or the situation we're now in, not incidentally that I think Stammer is any sort of reformist. I mean, if only, but he's not much. But you could see how reformism could very easily be ideological cover for business as usual. We need it for reforms. Second point, you mentioned the 3% typical annual growth. David Harvey came up with a fact, which I must say, when I read it initially, I was quite gobsmacked. It's very simple, and it is that 3% annual growth rate totals up to a doubling of the economy every generation, let's say every 25 years, doubling of the economy, right? Other things being equal, of course, they're not all equal, but other things being equal means a doubling of depletion of resources, doubling of pollution, doubling of all the bad stuff as well, right? So it's not just a question of, endless growth, it's endless, as Foster said, accumulation of catastrophes at that sort of rate, roughly speaking. And I think that's a very important point for discussion, because I think I was certainly gobsmacked when I came across the idea first. And I think quite a lot of people who haven't heard it would be. My third point was, actually, you've already answered it, was about Sato and the idea of Marx as a degrowth communist.
1 minute.
Now, given that we're saying communism is the main alternative to capitalism, and capitalism, we know, is not capable of degrowth in any sustained, substantial sense. In fact, quite a few degrowthers are complete charlatans, in my view, where it ends up, it sounds great at the beginning of the book, and towards the end, they're advocating return to Keynesianism. But I think there may be some mileage in Sato's point about the degrowth, in the sense that degrowth communism is possible, degrowth capitalism isn't, and therefore it's an alternative. I think you could say, and maybe this is what you're getting at, the idea of degrowth, in a sense, it's rather simplistic. It's a bit like just talking about overpopulation.
Please sum up.
As a, that sort of quantitative thing. Thank you.
Okay, so we got the comrade in the front row here, and then the woman at the end of the row.
Thanks. What I'll use my time for, I don't know if it was quite what I was going to talk about originally, but anyway, is this question of depopulation, because I was aware that the group in Britain, which perhaps was closest to this, I'm sorry, I'm not engaging in a deliberate polemic against the SWP or anything like that, but was socialist resistance. ACR, as it's now, anti-capitalism as it's now called. But Alan Thorne, when he wrote a book, which in many respects I would have said was a good book, and I hope you agree, but he got obsessed with reducing population, which I thought was completely wrong. He was allowing really with the sort of population matters people on the right wing of the Green Party on that, which I think doesn't help our case at all if we go down the neo-Malthusian route. I'm not clear to what extent ACR is still sort of interested in these questions, because they seem to have gone on along the arm Ukraine position at the moment. So I don't know, that doesn't seem compatible with ecological socialism or any other kind of socialism, quite honestly. But they were the people who did talk a lot about you know, they published a book which my partner, Resistance Books published a book which my partner translated from the French by Daniel, I think it was called Tampuro. Anyway, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I think that is important. I mean, the population is declining in the West. I mean, you've got the far right, like Maloney in Italy, banging on about depopulation, but yet she doesn't want people to come in from the rest of the world. You know, let them drown in the Mediterranean and at the same time complain about the Italian birth rate. You know, but the birth rate declines everywhere as women become more educated and get into the labor force. So I really don't think that is the principal problem, population. Look, there were other things I wanted to talk about in terms of, you know, maybe things like electric cars sound good, but on the other hand, you're extracting lithium and cobalt and things like that, which have a devastating effect on the Congo and on bits of Latin America. And I could go on, but I'll shut up.
Brilliant. Can we go to the comrade at the end of the row? Were you indicating to speak? Yeah, or was it the person behind you? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. I agree with you beautifully explained the limitation of the growing movement, whatever it is. However, I agree with the gentleman who said that I don't call Marx as the original philosopher or communist for degrowing. So yeah, you explained it, what the criticism is in the Marxists. They say that the grow comes from the surplus value, that you have to invest it against invested in terms of the capital to the system to exist. Otherwise, capitalism without investing more and more would not be a capitalist. It dies. But the investment doesn't have to be production, it can be money. So you have lots of capital, which is in forms of money, that has no values, but it's more valuable than any goods, any services or any production. So when the capital turns to be money, turns to be capital. So when you explained that GDP is calculated based on the whatever is in the market tradable. If you can trade it in the market, it will be calculated. If it's not, no matter what its services is produced at home by family members, labor families that they're producing food and for childcare or everything, it's not calculated because it's not tradable. It's not tradable with money. So this is what GDP is not reflecting what Marx says about the growth. And you explained it well. So I was just wanted to address it that Marxism is criticizing growth in capitalism, which is not GDP. It's that growth that they have to take, and comes from exploitation from human beings and the nature. And then, so you use nature, anything in the nature that you can trade it in the market. So in socialism is the alternative model for growing. It's not growing. So you can produce the industries to clean the seas, to produce healthier food, to have a better harmonic relationship with the environment, and without exploitation, without exploring, without wage slavery. Wage slavery is the core theory of the Marxism, that capitalism lives, and without wage slavery and that surplus of the value, capitalism doesn't exist. And so socialism is another model, but I call it its growing model. It's not degrowing.
Thank you. Can we go to the comrade in the black in the second row down here? Yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Martin. I thought that was a really thought-provoking talk. One of the things it made me think about when you were talking about the right-wing critiques of degrowth is some of the arguments, you know, any of us who want change in the world, want socialism or, you know, to stop climate change, get told, oh, you're just telling everyone they have to have less. And I think central to our actual argument is we think people should have more, and there is more already there about the waste in the system and everything else. But then you come up with another argument that capitalists sometimes use in the right wing. So you're against competition for profit. Yes, we are. Okay, so there'll be no growth. Won't there be no progress in society? In the socials, there'll be no progress. And I think we have to argue the opposite. And Martin finished by saying, you know, there would be growth in a different social society, but this would look completely different because it wouldn't be premised on we're competing for profits for a tiny minority at the top. It will be premised on a collective ownership of us thinking creatively, dynamically, as a class, as a whole, how can we produce the things we need to do? And actually, loads of our innovation is stopped by capitalism, isn't it? And loads of our creativity is stifled by that. And so you can imagine a different society, not premised on capitalist growth, having progress in a very different sort of way. And I think that Martin then talks about the need for revolutionary change. That's not an abstract. It's not to say, well, this is out there, because actually, if you even look today at struggles that are going on, you see a potential power that people have who actually are doing the work that creates the profits, that is driving the growth in this system. We're talking about change being made by that potential power they have to stop the profits being made here, not just bring this society to a standstill, but actually create a different society out of it that breaks with that capitalist dynamic and puts something very different on the agenda. So I think actually there's a lot of arguments here, but for us as socialists, we can come out of it armed with a different vision of how our side can go forward and with a very different society.
Thank you. Okay, could we go to the comrade in the fifth row with the glasses, and then after them, the comrade in the black t-shirt in the same row. Thanks.
Thanks. I wanted to start with a story about a friend of mine who years ago was working as a research assistant in a university, creating a new antibiotic. And he was one of a team in Manchester, and the other team was somewhere in Japan, I think, and another one in America. And they were all searching for a new antibiotic. The thing is, they couldn't cooperate to do this. It would have taken them 2 years maybe to create it if they cooperated, but they're all in competition with each other. So this antibiotic is now part of the capitalist system. It's not happening quicker to the benefit of people. And that fits with Amy's argument. Actually, we're not against progress, and we can actually have progress much better if we have a better organized society. But that wasn't quite what I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about John MacDonald, actually, who was on Radio 4 last week, talking about how he thought that Starmer was absolutely right. And what we needed, well, he didn't say that, but what he said was the agenda is growth, growth, growth in the British economy. He's supposed to be one of the lefties, right? He's not at all. He's thrown us under a bus by coming out with this crap argument about, you know, we have to, and that fits in with what Martin was saying about workers. And I think that's a really important point. You have to convince workers that actually we can do something differently and that your jobs aren't threatened by the fact that we can actually change things. And that's, I mean, Unite, I mean, it's a union that's got a fantastic amount of people in fossil fuels, arms industries, you name it. We've got to have those arguments in our industries about how we can change and have a different sort of society. And there is lots of disputes a minute about wages on oil rigs. And that's great because they're fighting back. But you have to be there to insert the argument about, well, let's fight back about this as well. So if you want to retrain, for example, on an oil rig, become somebody who works in renewables, you have to pay your own training fees. I mean, that's something you can take up. So there's really important arguments we can have. But I think the most important thing Martin said was you have to be in the movement. You have to be part of all those movements that are fighting back. So, I mean, if you go to, God help me, I went to a Momentum World Transformed event. I mean, honestly, you'd have slit your wrists if you'd been there very much longer, because it was all about there's nothing we can do. You can't do anything. The economy's trashed. They didn't have any answers at all. And the worst thing about that was there was 100 people there. 50% of them were young people. And I just thought, God, they're listening to this crap. We have to be there. We have to be there as revolutionaries everywhere we are, putting the argument that we can create a different society. We have the power, we have the strength, we have the ability to do it. And I think being part of the movement, and I'm really pleased that Martin said that we've got lots of common with people in degrowth. And actually, even the Greens, they're crap sometimes, but the Greens in my area have been fantastic on immigration. They've been on every single protest about supporting refugees. And then we were there on Saturday when we fight the fascists again. So, you know, I mean, I think you have to say, yeah, you do have to be part of that to argue with people. I'm really glad that I think socialists sometimes dismiss degrowth as middle-class wankers, really. But actually, they've got lots of things to say, and we need to be part of that debate.
If you could pass it down the road, back up to the same row. And after that, comrade, we'll go over this side. Yep.
So I just want to say thanks for calling out those three arguments as right-wing critiques of degrowth. And I just wanted to point out that those really aren't positions of degrowth people. I wanted to say, like, for example, that book you called out, The Case for Degrowth, the author, one of the authors also wrote a book called Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong. So I want to be really clear that, like, degrowth, if no one in the degrowth movement that we believe to be part of it believes in population degrowth, because the global north is already, like, you know, not growing. And then in the global south, like, as you pointed out, the global south does not at this point have enough to support its population, again, because of, like, you know, the terrible constraints that the global north has placed upon them. In the degrowth movement, we want the global south to grow. And actually, and also it's really about, we want them to do what is right for them, right? The capitalist system has made everything in the world the same. There is a model that everyone has to follow. That is not how it should be. And so, like, you know, degrowth is about, like, taking those constraints away from everyone. And then the third thing I wanted to say is, yes, I agree that's, you know, definitely lots to be done on degrowth policy, but there's tons of super radical stuff in the degrowth movement that I just wanted to call out. Jason Hickel, many other people though, like Jason Hickel's one person in this whole movement, but he is really advocating for universal basic services right now. So basically decommodify the shit out of everything, you know, make sure that, like, you know, we take all of that out of the capitalist markets and make it a universal basic right for everyone, completely abandon fossil fuels, move towards a renewable industry or renewable world, and a job guarantee. So basically, anyone who wants to work gets a job, and that, you know, that will, arguably that's a hugely, like, revolutionary approach that will take away the viability of all of these 0 hours contracts, like low minimum wage jobs. So I just wanted to call that out as, like, and thank you for saying that, because I think that it does have a marketing problem sometimes, degrowth, and so, like, I don't want anyone to walk out of this session thinking that those are things that degrowth movement believes in. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. If the microphone could go to the comrade at the end of the front row over here.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Finally. Excellent meeting, but I also thought that even though there have been important comments on the question of population and so on, I think there's a bit more that we can say. Because here we are in a situation where the competition and the exploitation, the combination of exploitation and competition that Martin talked about, leads to concentration and monopoly. And that means whole swathes of people are deprived accordingly. I mean, I'm from Africa, I'm from Ghana. If you take a majority of our societies and perhaps half the world, you know, 150 years ago, the concept of mass unemployment would have been utterly ridiculous to anyone. Okay, we all farm, we work, whatever it is that we do. So clearly it is the concentration of the means of production in fewer and fewer hands that creates unemployment, and with it creates the very notion of a surplus population, which is closely related to the idea of overpopulation. That's where it comes from. And we see that repeatedly, not simply 150 years ago, but in the here and now. Here we are in the teeth of the food and energy crisis, for example. One of the causes of that crisis is exactly that, monopoly. Through the dominant for the ABCD grain, you know, for example, the four companies, the group of 4 companies which together are called ABCD from their initials, dominate about 80% of world grain and wheat trade, for example. Okay, they choose to concentrate a lot of their investments in places like Ukraine and Russia for all manner of reasons, including soil fertility, including the shift in land relations and so on, which has opened up, including the fact that they can control sea lanes and shipments from that area and so on and so forth. But almost everywhere in the world grows wheat. Yet here we are with massive inflation in terms of wheat and all kinds of grains, when in fact there has been a growth in the production of wheat even during the Russian-Ukraine war. Growth hasn't dropped, okay? Sorry, in terms of the actual production, it hasn't dropped. The price has grown precisely because of the monopoly that has taken place, with the consequence of hundreds of millions of people, being without and so on. And those are immediately transformed by mechanisms like that and 100 others into surplus populations, which in the context of racism, in the context of the migration crisis, we have to confront directly. And in confronting that directly, it is true that in different locales and through different struggles, many people can come up with their own local solutions and so on. But the very notion of the monopoly means that we can't walk away and turn back and step aside from the concentrations of wealth, of technology, of know-how that are in the grasp of big multinational companies and so on and so forth. It's not simply that we can all do what we want. Yes, by all means we should, but we can only do so also through coordination and harmonization and unifying our interests because of the way in which we can integrate our struggles to seize back that wealth, to turn it to different purposes, to turn it both in terms of the transition and in terms of the ultimate goals of the new society that we wish to create. So, yes, my time is over, 101 things to say, but ultimately it requires us not simply to be anti-capitalist in our own localities. It requires us to be internationalists, to take on all the powers of the world, to take on imperialism. It requires us to be revolutionary socialists, which means for today, it requires you to join the SWP.
Thank you. Okay, so could we go to the comrade at the other end of this row, please? Yeah. And then the last contribution will be, yeah, you over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was just a quick question about, yeah, maybe Jason doesn't want to, also I'm just here for like learning and I don't have that much experience in the SW stuff, so thanks. Maybe Jason doesn't want to be like aligned with socialists because, I don't know, it sort of like does something to like the ordinary person that doesn't really know stuff about like socialists or have like a socialist family or, you know, an academic kind of socialist aligning. And I guess similarly to like Extinction Rebellion, you know, they were quite like, you know, they were talking about being beyond politics, so it's not to divide people. So I wonder whether Jason is actually quite revolutionary. And like that lady was saying before, that, you know, the suggestions Hickel has, they might not be like revolution itself, but the things that he is advocating are revolutionary-like. So yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of like bringing more people along with you by not talking about a revolution, because in the like the public imaginary, it's very difficult to imagine what that would be like. You know, most people don't wake up and they're like, okay, yeah, revolution. They're like, no, I'm like in this system, and what does that even look like? So it's a more, I don't know, it's just more of like a tangible thing. Someone do that.
Thanks. Okay, so the last contribution from this other end here.
Thank you. So when I came here today, I thought about being quiet and not saying anything. But when people start to talk about population, it really triggered me because we are like in a first world country and we are still discussing population. I thought this topic would be like a already decided topic. It's like, because that's new Malthusianism, you know, and that's a really complicated topic. That's really prejudicial topic. It's a very bad way that the West is saying like all the world, thinking that the actual problem with research is population. And that's just neo-Malthusianism. Sorry, my English, but that's really bad that people are even discussing it today. That's not a topic to be discussed. So let's remember that like the US, what people waste every day is, I don't know, 10 times more than average Brazilian. Let's remember that everything in the UK is packed because they have a big, huge oil industry here. So they need to pack everything. A few months ago, they were packing bananas. So that, and this idea of the growth brings a logic where like, first it's a very bad branding because like everybody wants growth somehow. And secondly, it brings an idea that, oh, look, this very rational logic of growing is not getting us anywhere. But in the first place, I don't think that the logic of capitalism is rational at all. So we know how to like use electric cars for more than 100 years. That's not a new thing.
1 minute.
We know how to make like plastic from soybeans more than 100 years as well. But there's no interest in doing that. So the problem is not necessarily growing. The problem is the system. So we ship things, I don't know, to Asia to have them shipped back, just to make money. That's the logic of capitalism. The problem is not like minimalism or degrowth or any name we can think. You know, it's the problem is like to think about capitalism and to think about a different system, but it's so taboo. I don't know about the UK, but in Brazil it's so taboo to talk about communism, to talk about socialism. It became like a very non-topic, and then people start to prefer like, oh, degrowth, oh, minimalism.
Please sum up.
You know, so just that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Sorry to those who didn't get to speak. Just before I bring Martin back in, I've just got some announcements. The first is the opening rally kicks off tonight at 7 p.m. at Friends Meeting House. We'll be joined by Chris Smalls, who's unionised Amazon in the US, and many others. Secondly, if you've left luggage in the luggage room, please do collect that. And finally, please do take a trip to Bookmarks over the weekend where you can pick up all of the books that were mentioned. Over to you, Martin.
Sorry, I had to choose the right glasses. I've now got 3 pairs. My eyesight's degrowing. Look, there's a lot in this talk, and I can't do justice to everybody's questions. As I always say, if I don't answer your question, it's in my book, and you can buy it at the end and help Bookmarks grow their economy. I'll start though with a little bit on population, because I think it's the comrade who spoke right at the end is absolutely right. Isn't it a tragedy that in the 21st century we're still having this discussion that essentially blames the people of the global south, black and brown people, for the world's crisis, the crisis of hunger, the crisis of the environment, the crisis of everything else. I mean, it is a tragedy we're having it, but we do have to have the discussion because the right wing foist it upon us. It's one of their key ways of trying to divert anger away from the system. This is why Marx and Engels spent so much time arguing against the reverent scribbler, as they called it, Malthus, in their letters and in their pamphlets and in their talks, because they saw that what Malthus was doing was to finding ways to excuse the system. There are hungry people because there's too many of them. There are poor people because there's too many of them. They have too many children. Look at them, the horrible people doing these things. If only they were all like us middle-class English vicars, they wouldn't do that. What Marx and Engels do is to cut through it and to say, look, the problem isn't that. The problem is a capitalist system that deprives of it. There's a beautiful passage from Engels where he writes about why are there poor people? It's not because there's not enough food. He says it's because they haven't got any money in their pockets. There's plenty of food. And that's the same today. There's plenty of food to feed people in the global south. It's just it's not profitable to sell it to them. There's plenty of ways and technologies that could help solve the environmental crisis. It's not profitable to do it. And it's their excuse. And I think that the rise in population that we've seen it's a very complex factor. I mean, if you're really interested, I spoke at Marxism a few years ago, and I think it's probably on YouTube about this. But there are complex reasons why population grows and why it starts to fall. But I don't think that we can equate the growth in population that has taken place since the Second World War with the growth of the capitalist economy, because actually population growth is often closely linked to poverty, because people have more children because they need help on the farm or in their communities or to look after them in the old life. And that's why when economies start to strengthen, there's a tendency to have smaller numbers of children. There are other factors too. You know, people need to have the choices to make these about access to the ability to contraception and education and so on. Whatever those factors are, I think that, we have to start. Firstly, the people of the world are not to blame. They're our allies in changing the world, and indeed the masses of the global south will be with the masses of the north when we overthrow capitalism. But we also, as somebody said, we have to point to the irrationality of the capitalist system, a capitalist system that complains about not having enough workers and then won't let people drown in the Mediterranean. This is, something we have to argue and fight on. I'd like to see more NHS staff, and I don't care where they come from in the world. And if they're on the boats, they should be let in. And that's why absolutely revolutionary socialists stand for all refugees to be welcome, for all immigrants to be welcome. Somebody mentioned the argument against socialism. Capitalism is a lovely dynamic system, and if you don't have it, then workers and people will have less. let's be absolutely clear, the working class has got less, and it's getting less. You know, the life of my generation and the generation that will come after less, you know, we will have less choices, less access to things because of the way capitalism is. And capitalist innovation, they celebrate it, don't they? They talk about growth all the time and how this growth forces people to invent new products and new technologies, isn't it? But it's not about solving problems or dealing with inequality or helping save the planet or ending poverty. It's about making the latest iPhone that you can get that so people go out and buy it and maximize their profit. Capitalist innovation happens not because of the desire by the capitalists to solve needs. They do it to make profits, and that's why we have to counterpose it with a completely different way of organising society, a complete break with the past. And electric cars came up. I can't remember why, but you know, they like to say about, oh great, we've now got these batteries and electric cars that can do all these wonderful things, but electric cars won't solve the environmental crisis. The only thing they'll solve is the crisis of the car industry. That's what they exist for, to re-improve profit rates for the car manufacturers and their allies. And in a rational society, they wanted to look at public transport and say, how can we change public transport to improve the environment? We'd say, well, let's renationalise the railways. Let's build more buses and more trains and more trams, and let's employ more workers in those industries. That's the way to use innovation to transform our economies in the interest of the planet, not building massive SUVs driven on electric batteries. And I think we take this in all sorts of other ways, because when they celebrate dynamism, when they celebrate the growth and the constant growth of the economic system, they talk about the things, the commodities we could have. You know, everyone have a better washing machine and a new iPhone and the rest of it. Think about how we might do it in the future. Think about how we would organise society. I don't think every household under socialism will have a washing machine. We'll have communal laundries that are the best washing machines, where we can actually do things collectively and solve problems. Similarly with food, we don't need to duplicate this. The only reason that we duplicate this in white goods and all sorts of other commodities is because it's great for the capitalists and it's not great for us. And then that really, I want to come back to that thing about dynamism, because it's the only thing they've got really to celebrate about their system. Because if they don't celebrate innovation, what else can they celebrate? The growth of poverty, the growth of hunger, the growth of of environmental destruction and the rest of it. And there's an interesting thing about Marx. You see, when I was first a young socialist, and I think this is true of many, many people, I picked up the Common Manifesto, and then I was really amazed because Marx spends the first third of it saying how great capitalism is. You think, really? It's not what I expected at all. Why does he do that? He's celebrating how the development of the means of production have enabled a new way of organising society, have shown and demonstrated that we can really develop forces of production that can provide all sorts of things. But then he says, but it only goes so far, doesn't it? It's much better than the previous ways, the slave societies or the feudal societies, but it only goes so far. You know, the development of forces of production eventually become a fetter on the further development of the means of production. And that, I think, is really clear today. You know, you cannot imagine capitalism developing in a way that is going to make the environment better or people's lives better. And so when they say and celebrate capitalism's dynamism, we have to point to the reality, because there are things that grow in society that they don't celebrate. The number of food banks has grown by 116% in the last 2 years. The number of evictions from homes in England went up by 33% in the first 2 months of this year. Those are the real reality. That's the real consequence of growth. It's the growth not just of catastrophe, but the minor little horrors of everyday life that people and working people experience under capitalism. Marx says, look, capitalism, it's great because it's done all this stuff. It's laid the material basis for socialism. In that sense, what he meant is that it's developed all these technologies and these industries and so on that working people, if they only had control of them, could use in the most rational and beautiful ways to improve everyone's lives and so on. And he talked about revolution. And I don't think the problem is that Jason Hickel doesn't want to talk about revolution. Jason Hickel's very happy to use the language and phrases and quotes from Marx. In fact, the book about Keiho Sato that everyone's talking about, Marx as a degrowth communist, has got an endorsement from Jason Hickel on the back of it. But I think Jason Hickel does what many people do, is they take the economic core of Marx, that critique of capitalism, that explanation of the dynamism of capitalism, but they then don't take the revolutionary core of Marx. And Marx never separated the two. He said that actually we have to understand capitalism in order to overthrow it. And so my final point really is to emphasize, I think, a point that I tried to make in the start, which is that really we have to counterpose it to capitalism's endless drive for growth, a vision of a society based on ordinary people owning and controlling and democratically planning and organizing their rational, in the language of Marx, metabolism of the rational metabolism with nature in a rational way. And that will require workers' power. That can only come out of the revolutionary transformation of society. We should celebrate the fact that degrowth theory has made more people critical of capitalism. We should celebrate the fact that it's offered us insights into how the modern capitalist economy works. We should celebrate the fact that it's opened up a language that allows us to talk about how capitalism cannot work. But we have to go one step further. We have to be honest and say, if we want a sustainable, equitable world, if we want a future for our children and grandchildren, then it has to be one where we transform how society works, because otherwise the future won't be endless growth. The future will be catastrophe, nuclear war, capitalist horror, hunger and malnutrition on an enormous scale. And actually we want something better. And that can, I think, come from a future socialist society that will arise out of our struggles. But let's be also honest, revolution won't automatically happen. Revolution won't just come because millions of people are pissed off with how capitalism is. Revolution will come because ordinary people fight for it, and because there are revolutionary organizations in every workplace, in every trade union branch, in every community, in every school and college that says this is how we have to organize now to fight and win in the short term and for that longer goal. And that's really the task that the SWP has set itself for. And I hope you work with us, and I hope you'll join us. Thank you very much, everyone.